Excellent. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Bree. Just so while I'm checking that this is working, and it is, because I've just checked that, I'll come back to the beginning. In answer to your question, Ray, about behavioral economics and qual, I think behavioral economics helps us researchers understand people more, or it helps, as Bree said, give us a language to explain people's behavior more. So I think all the experimentation is absolutely wonderful, but there's no reason whatsoever why qualitative researchers shouldn't take advantage of it. So that's my view on that. Anyway, I'll move on to talking about my introduction to qualitative analysis. It is very much as in an introduction. I'm going to be talking a lot about how people analyse, how qual researchers analyse, as well as the why. What I'm actually going to be doing is to introduce the talk by talking about some myths, and there are two particular myths that I want to talk about straight away. The first one is that you don't need to do any qual analysis at all, and I hear this from people because they say they're gurus and they're experts and they kind of intuitively get the results. I personally don't think that's true most of the time. Might be true some of the time. I'd be generous, I guess, there. The second myth, I think, it comes from the academic sphere, which is that you have to analyse all the time, and you have to do really, really detailed coding of absolutely everything, and I don't think that's true either. So what I'm going to be doing today is actually looking at 5 different ways in which you can organise qualitative data as part of your analysis. There aren't really any rules. There are no absolutes here. It is, after all, qualitative. So for my agenda, I'm going to be talking about why analyse. Might seem obvious, but it isn't always done, as I've just said. Actually, what you analyse, how you do it. And I've got some examples from my own work. So here's why. Yes, here's why. Oh no. Here's why, and it's to make sense out of all of this. You might not necessarily expect to see a pile of Lego in a qual analysis presentation, but it suits my purposes perfectly. If we look at that pile of Lego, we might, if we were doing some quant, sort it all out into different types of yellow and white and different sizes and all that kind of thing, and count them and make sense of it by counting them. But that's not the only way that you can make sense out of this. First, in qualitative terms, we'd probably sort it out as well. We might sort it out into colours and shapes. We might also sort it out into other things as well. So we might be able to sort it out into the things that can make a house and the things that can make a car, and all sorts of other ways in which things can be sorted out. But we can also look at this pile of Lego and just look at the possibilities there. It's just simply look at the possibilities, gain insight from simply examining what's there and how all those things fit together, which you don't necessarily get from quantitative analysis, where you're simply counting the yellows and the whites and the greens and all of that. The other reason this suits my purposes perfectly is because we don't actually know what's underneath this pile of Lego. It could all be stuck to a bit of cardboard as far as we know. The qualitative analysis is really about what lies beneath. It's about exploring what is under there. So that's why we do it. Qualitative data is always messy. What you see on the surface is rarely the whole truth, and what you see on the surface often needs sorting out in all sorts of different ways in order for you to make really good sense of it. So that's the why in brief. And my point here is that analysing is more than summarising, and you need to be flexible in the way that you look at this data. You might have looked at the pile of Lego, for example, and have set out trying to build a fire engine, and what you might be looking at is, well, no, it's not going to actually work out that way. There doesn't appear to be any wheels. So how we look at that data depends very much on what we're looking at it for. So the best qual analysis helps you interpret the data to solve your client's problem. It's not just what's there, but what can you do with what's there in terms of what your client wants. So that's why we do it. And then what we do it with is, as on this chart, everything. So we analyze everything. As I've got here, we've got a transcript. At the top of my page, it's a transcript. We might have notes. We might have our own feelings of being in the room in a group discussion. We might have made notes in a journal or just on pieces of paper. we've got audio, we've got video, we've got analysis of body language. All of that is what we would analyze as part of qual analysis. For example, just recently doing a pack sort, we had about 15 packs, all of which we're trying to segment by doing a pack sort, and it was extraordinary how much sort of energy and bonding it came in the room when one particular pack was talked about. Everyone seemed to move forward in their chairs, smiled, and the energy of the room lifted. So that isn't a finding, it's just part of the findings, of course. And the reason I've put perception in the middle of all of that is because, of course, it is perception. It's your perception of the transcript of the feeling in the room, of your notes, of the audio, and so on. And the reason we do qual analysis as well is because, of course, it's subjective, but we need to be, if I can put this in Bree's terms, be using system 2 thinking, not system 1 thinking, despite the fact that we're dealing with very subjective data. My next point is that how much you analyse depends on the project. We all know that market research and social research projects vary enormously, and there are some that are what you call light touch. You know, some that they're very easy. They're 3 groups. You did them this week. You gave the client a couple of days, the client the results a couple of days later, or they were watching them, so they figured it out. It's some kind of transitory thing that doesn't last. It was not a big strategic issue. So we have those and we analyse those differently. But many of us also work on much more dense projects, which are intense, which are strategic, which have very much a long-term view. We analyse those differently, and it's a continuum. I very much want to get away from the suggestion that qual analysis is always the same. It's very much not. So the project and the information your client needs to determine the best way to analyse is my message. So how do we go about doing it? What we do is to go through what I've got here, a sequence, which I've also described as an iterative and thorough, in big letters, sequence. There are 7 stages to this, and I'll just quickly go through them, and I'm going to come back to them. First of all, we all know, if we've done any qual at all, that you start to analyse during fieldwork. Some people say they analyse before fieldwork. I don't really think that's true. I think you might start to think about it, but don't really start to analyse because you haven't got any data. But you certainly are likely to analyse during fieldwork. There's then a process where you need to organise or manage what you've got. You need to sort out all that Lego in some way or another. Then we need to go through steps that I've called segmenting, categorising, and observing patterns, which are effectively all about synthesising. They're taking the way in which we've organised our data and bringing it down to point 6, which is interpretation, and 7, reporting the analysis and interpretation. And it's still very much the case, certainly for me, that I'm still analysing while I'm writing, because I know that if I write a PowerPoint chart or a paragraph in Word and it doesn't really make sense, it's just not quite getting it, then I realise that I haven't analysed it properly, I need to rethink it, and I need to go back up a few steps before I can really report it properly. So we would expect that. We expect it to be iterative, we expect it to jump around, but ultimately I would expect a proper qual analysis to cover all of those 7 steps and to end up with the 7th. I think that's probably the only rule. The one thing I would caution you against is the siren that can lure you to the rocks, which is that wonderful insight that you get during field work that you completely fall in love with because you think it's just the best idea and insight ever. This happens to all of us. Don't believe yourself for all the reasons that Bree has outlined. Your brain can fool you. Park the idea, note the idea, recognise that you've had the insight, but don't use the rest of the field work trying to justify the fact that your insight was wonderful. I know this happens to a lot of people. It has certainly happened to me, and you need to work against it. You need your system 2 thinking happening here. In a minute, I'm going to talk about 5 different ways in which I organise or manage some of the data, the qual data that I've worked with, but I'm just going to quickly jump to number 5, which is observing patterns, which is part of the synthesizing stage of qual analysis. Just because a couple of days ago I saw a report from someone else, a qual report in which they'd basically done one slide per group on a particular thing. So group 1 said this, group 2 said this, group 3 said this. That's not qual analysis, that's qual reporting, I think, and missing out some of the most important stages. It's your job as the researcher to find the patterns and to synthesize it and bring it all together. And I will make a quick point here that sometimes people find this hard with qual because you might do 5 groups and one thing wasn't said in the 5th group, or you might do 20 depth interviews and something was only mentioned in 10 of them. And this sometimes bothers people and they think, well, how can I synthesize that if not everybody has said everything? And my answer to that is twofold. First of all, we tend not to worry in quantitative whether that's true or not. We tend to be reasonably happy with things like 70%. But the second thing is that we need to remember how contextual qual data is. So if it didn't occur in the 5th group, it could it may well have been for contextual reasons and not because it wasn't a valid finding. So those are the things we need to understand before we, as we're synthesizing, we need to know what we're rejecting and we need to know what we're including, and we need to be very clear as to why we're doing that. So I'll move on now to the 5 different ways in which I personally organize or manage my qual data. There's annotation, coding manually, using a big piece of paper or a whiteboard, using Excel, which might perhaps surprise people who aren't used to doing that of qual data, and doing things that are movable, which will make much more sense when I tell you what I mean, and you're probably familiar with anyway. So these are all slightly disguised examples from my own work. Okay, so this was a case study in which I used annotation, and the first point is that it was face-to-face depth interviews which had been audio taped and transcribed. Really, really important point, because they'd been transcribed, I was able to import them straight into qual software. I don't use qual software a great deal, and this is my only example out of these, but in this particular case, it was wonderful to be able to use it. I didn't need to segment the data, so I only had 10 people after all. So what I was really, really, really interested in was the detail of what customer service was to the people that I was interviewing. So what I needed to do was to go through the transcripts and annotate all the different versions of customer service. Some people thought they delivered good customer service by smiling at people. Other people thought they delivered good customer service by making sure that the person had achieved their outcome. And there were other different versions of that. And the client really wanted to know all that detail, so I needed to go through it thoroughly, and it was about annotating. And you might or might not be able to see my scribbles on that particular chart, but as part of that annotation, it also includes my notes and my thoughts as I was going through. So it helped deconstruct perceptions of customer service in a small study. It just worked really well. But there's no reason why we have to do it that way all the time. Imagine if I'd done 100 depth interviews, certainly wouldn't want to be going through them in that depth unless we wanted to be there all year. So a way, not just the way. So my next one is manually coding. Let's see if this chart comes up. I worried a lot about this one because at first I kept thinking, how am I going to do this? The project was about 1,000 people. They'd all contributed to an online conversation which was unmoderated, which basically meant they talked about whatever they liked, apart from a very sort of general question they all responded to. And it just created a huge, huge unwieldy data set. And I wasn't at all sure how I was going to go about it. And I wanted to code it like you'd code an open end, but felt that that was the wrong thing to do because my client wanted a qualitative answer, not a code frame. But in the end realized it was the only way to do it. I had to reduce it all the way down. So I coded it into the things that you might be able to see on your screen. More time to think, more longer term thinking, more big picture thinking. They're all very kind of precise. And then what I did there was to categorize them all together. I got into the synthesizing stage. This one doesn't really give you the example, the one I've put there, but for example, there were quite a lot of comments about littering. That was bad. There was quite a lot of comments about homeless people, some of which was positive and some of which was negative. There were quite a lot of comments about climate change and all kinds of things like that. And what I needed to do first of all was to put all the climate change things together and then I'll group it into environmentalism and then synthesize to get to my one-pager, which my client wanted, which was to do with self-reliance and social responsibility, and self-respect. And they were the big themes that needed to come out of it. But I actually had to manually code all that to make sure that I'd really understood all of it and I'd been thorough in what I was doing. It was unusual, but it was effective in the end. The third case study is using my big piece of paper or whiteboard approach. The diagram I've got for you, the illustration I've got for you, is actually not a real one because my real ones were way too messy to show. So it's kind of a pretend one. But really, all we have here is something very simple. We're all used to 3 face-to-face groups, different spec for each group, heavy users, light users. You know the drill. We didn't have time to have transcriptions, but we did have notes. We definitely needed to compare across the user base. Comparison was more important than detailed behavior analysis in this particular case. So you can pretty much, it's what you see is what you get here. Summarizing the key themes on one sheet of paper whiteboard, you can eyeball it, you can synthesize very, very quickly because it's small. And again, I wouldn't do that if I had 10 groups. I'd reduce it down before I got to that stage. I wouldn't do it. I might do it if I had 10 depths, but I wouldn't do it if I had more, because you don't synthesize, you get lost in the trees. If you unless you only use that one for that kind of example, is my advice. The fourth one is using Excel. Now this is a live project. We're doing 50 depth interviews. They're segmented into 4 types, and I need to understand the behavior of attitudes of 4 different types of people. And my client wants really, really detailed understanding of their behavior and their processes that they went through. And so we've simply put it into Excel. There's 1 row per respondent or participant, and it's perfect in this case because it allows us to search, it allows us to sort, and it allows us to kind of eyeball it as well. And we can track back to individual transcripts. Now, unlike the software that I showed you before, I could have, in that case, linked it. I clicked on the verbatim, and it would have taken me straight to the transcript, and I could have read the whole thing and got the verbatim. Here, of course, it doesn't. So what I do try and do is, and this is why I do it in Excel in many cases, is to copy and paste the verbatim into the Excel so that I can find it again in Word pretty easily. So it's, and of course you can track it back by respondent as well. So that actually can get a bit painful, but it's and the other thing that can get a bit painful about this is if you change your mind about about the columns here as to what's relevant, because you do need to go back. I don't think there's any way out of that. I think it's a natural part of how this all works. I use that way of analysing qualitative data because it helped to understand this kind of complex process in detail and to understand different types of people. So that was that. And my fourth one is the movable one, which, as possibly would have guessed if you've done this all kind of thing before, involve post-it notes, but it could also involve any kind of cards and shuffle cards and the like. This came from an online bulletin board focus group where the data from the forum discussion and smartboards and across the whole number of days, 2 days we did it, had similar themes emerging across all of the themes. What I needed to do was to bring it into some kind of logical space. I needed to categorize, I needed to find the patterns, and they weren't immediately apparent. So the best way to do it was this way. So I used post-its that could be grouped and regrouped. I've ended up with started out with yellow, green, and pink. But the yellow ones then split up into, some went into effort and some went into culture, and then some of the culture ones split up and went into emotion. So it's that sort of thing, really identifying the themes by moving things around. It helped to untangle those closely related themes, which is what I have said there. So the reason I've gone through that is because, as an introduction, I thought people do actually ask me this question as to how you actually do it, and do you have to do it this way or do you have to do it that way? And of course the answer is you have to do it the way your data and your project tells you to do it. So the way you analyze depends on the kind of data you're working with and also what you want to find out at the end. And I just have one last slide here on Qual Analysis, which will come up in a minute. Here we go, Qual Analysis software. As I mentioned, I don't use it a lot. I'm not the world's greatest expert on Qual Analysis software. I've used 3 or 4 different types, and for me, they break down into 2 different types. You see how analytical I am. The coding type, such as NVivo and Atlas. Atlas has got some other things happening there, but so you go through and you identify pretty much. There's no point in doing it unless you do it really, really thoroughly, I think, and identify everything that everybody said and make supercodes out of smaller codes and themes out of supercodes and so on. It's time consuming, but can be invaluable if it's a very large study. Then there are a different type altogether, which I call the word cloud type, that synthesize straight away. Leximancer, I would say, is like that. And Wordle too, simplistically, and I use that word advisedly. Wordle, if you're not familiar with it, is what you basically can do is to select your entire transcript, has to be typed obviously, select your entire transcript, copy it, paste it into www.wordle.net.au, I think it is, could be, no, not .au, .net or .com, wordle.com, and follow the instructions and it'll create a lovely word cloud for you. I sometimes use them partly way through the process. I used it partly way through the manual coding process just to see where I was going to go. But in my experience, they pretty much always disguise the real insights and just tell you what's blindingly obvious. But that's just been my experience. Other people might have had a different one. So you can manipulate them, of course. What you can do if you want just to create a good picture is to simply take out all of the most obvious words. For example, if you're doing something on soft drink, you might want to take out soft and drink. You can manipulate it like that to get more insight, but otherwise I personally find them very simplistic. But the reason for doing using Qual Analysis software is it does help you manage very large data sets. It does help if you've got multiple researchers working where you can combine everything. It can be a great storage place for all your data, including your visuals and your video and your notes and whatever else, and it does help. It's the best really as far as searching and finding verbatims. So that's basically it's the end of my introduction to qualitative analysis. I shall wait for some questions.